Hello, my name is Carlton Burt, and I'm the Speaker Director for Breath of Life Television Ministries.
And I'm Roy Ice, the Speaker Director for Faith for Today. And Carlton, I'm so excited to be with you today and finally get to work alongside you.
The privilege is mine, as well as my pleasure to work alongside you. I believe we're going to have a great day, and I believe we have some exciting information, very informative, that we need to share with our viewers.
It's not just informative. This is life-changing stuff today, so I can't wait for us to get to it. So why don't we just go ahead and dive on in?
Let's get to it. Welcome to our special dialogue today as we consider the effect of COVID-19 upon our communities and potential ways we can protect ourselves and those we love from this horrible virus. Today's program is entitled, Is the COVID Vaccine Trustworthy? A Biblical Conversation About Science. Our goal during our time together is to help find answers to some of the questions that have arisen about the COVID vaccine and help you make an informed decision on whether the vaccine is right for you and your loved ones.
The past 14 months have seen our lives impacted like we never could have imagined. In the United States alone, more than 32 million people have contracted COVID-19 and more than 575,000 lives have been lost.
Once the COVID-19 virus was identified, scientists began working to develop a vaccine to prevent the spread of the disease and ultimately save lives and prevent long-term health challenges.
But many people are still skeptical of the vaccine and have either delayed getting it or decided not to receive it at all. The purpose of our program today is to help answer any of the potential questions you may have about the effectiveness or safety of the vaccine.
Our experts will look at 5 main areas in our conversation about the COVID vaccine. The first, we'll look at the spiritual foundation behind making a decision or not to take the vaccine, and also the importance of respecting the personal choice of others.
Our second panel of experts will look into the science behind vaccines and how the COVID-19 vaccine was developed. They will also look at some of the questions that have come up about the safety of the vaccine, and we'll try to dispel some of the myths, both pro and con.
The third panel of experts will delve into the usefulness of vaccines and the role they play in overall public health. They will also discuss the essential role that following a healthy lifestyle plays in combating disease, including the spread and impact of COVID-19.
Our fourth group of experts will discuss how we can respectfully discuss these issues with friends and family and neighbors who may have a different perspective on the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine.
The fifth and final group of experts will discuss how ultimately this is an opportunity for mission and healing. And as Christians, we can play an important role in how our broader communities will achieve healing from this pandemic.
Following these panels, several of our participants will be available to respond to the questions you've sent to us over the past few weeks about the COVID vaccine. We will conclude our broadcast with a short devotional thought from Elder G. Alexander Bryant, the president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America.
But before we begin, let's meet someone who was directly affected by COVID-19. I would like to introduce you to Merlin Medley, who will be serving as the moderator for our panel discussions today, who will introduce our special guests. Good to see you, Merlin, and we look forward to today's discussion.
4.
Thank you, Carlton. It's great seeing you as well. I have the pleasure of introducing Jacqueline Prillman from Maryland. She is a nurse and a COVID-19 survivor.
Thank you, Milan. Yes, I am a COVID-19 survivor, and what an honor and privilege to be here to share my testimony. Last Sunday, Mother's Day, was a day of thanksgiving and joy for our family, as it was on Mother's Day 2020, that I was discharged from the hospital on 6 liters of oxygen. As you know, my story is of one miracle after another and God interceding every step of the way. However, today I will share a very condensed version. When I contracted COVID-19, there was limited information at that time, and I, for one, never imagined that I was going to be on the receiving end of this virus. I did not fall into the group or categories that were considered high risk, or so I thought, but I want to be very clear that we know different today. It was a Sabbath morning in April of 2020 when I woke up with all the classic COVID symptoms: chills, fever, body ache, muscle ache, headache, like I had never experienced before. I would later describe it to the doctors as if it were animals eating and chewing my brain. I also had nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of taste and smell, cough, and the big one was shortness of breath. I was very restless that Sabbath, asking God in the night. I went to the seat that evening and I kept telling them that I was air hungry, I couldn't breathe, but I was told that my oxygen saturation was 95 to 96 and the numbers were great. I didn't have any.
We might have lost her.
Yeah, it looks like we're having a bit of technical difficulties. We lost track of Jacqueline right now, but we will keep it moving and see if we can come back to her at another time. For now, let's prepare to start our first panel.
Merlin, thank you for introducing us to this wonderful person. Her story is harrowing, and we're so thankful she continues to make a positive recovery following her experience with COVID. I know her story is similar to millions of others, and hopefully it can inspire our viewers to do all they can to stay safe and help protect not only themselves, but their local communities as well.
Our first panel discussion today looks at the relationship between science and religion. And our guests are renowned evangelist, Elder Mark Finley, Adventist church historian, and the director of the Ellen G. White Estate, Elder Merlin Burt, and Dr. Peter Landless, ordained minister and also the health ministries director of the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Merlin, we look forward to your discussion. And here's the first question for your esteemed panel. Can you please describe what the relationship was between the early Christian church and science? And what can we learn from it today?
5, 4, 3.
That's a great question, Roy. Unfortunately, we don't have time to span 2,000 years of early Christian history, but we can cover about 200 years ago. Thankfully, we have Dr. Merlin Burt, who can help provide some guidance and some insight into what the pioneers were thinking about science. So, Dr. Burt, can you go ahead and share some examples of what early Adventists thought about vaccines, if possible, or about science as a whole?
Thank you, Ilan. I appreciate the question. Adventists, of course, our movement began during the time of the developing of vaccines, particularly smallpox. And so there were varied feelings about the vaccine. It's an interesting to look at Ellen White's experience on this. Since I'm director of the White Estate, I could mention a little bit about it. We don't have anything from Ellen White herself one way or the other about vaccines. So we don't have clear guidance prophetically from this, but we do have some interesting stories that are connected to vaccines that relate to Ellen White and her experience and those who worked with her. The first story has to do with her son, W.C. White. He remembered that as a young boy, he had received the smallpox vaccination and had had a pretty negative effect from it. And this caused him to say that his mother found the question of vaccines perplexing. So she didn't have clear divine revelation on it. She was watching it. They were kind of negative about it for a while. But later, as the vaccines became had less complications, and there was more safety and connected with them, W.C. White was in a setting, and the other staff members, where they thought that maybe it would be good to get a vaccine for smallpox again there. It had been some years. And so they did do that with Ellen White's support. She was supportive of this in light of the information that she had learned about it being more dangerous to have the disease than the vaccine. Probably a very touching story is one of Ellen White's other assistants, Doris Robinson. He's the author of the book, Story of Our Health Message, and also worked with Ellen White as an assistant for a number of years. And in the same year, Ellen White's last year of life, someone wrote to him about asking about vaccines. And he was clear to say that Ellen White didn't have specific light from God on this issue. But he went on to explain that an experience had happened to him that was particularly challenging. His own uncle, D.A. Robinson, who was a missionary in India, had decided not to get the vaccine for smallpox, whereas those around him had. And they had mild symptoms or no symptoms, but he actually contracted smallpox. And on his deathbed, as he was dying, he wished that he had taken the vaccine. And so this predisposed D.E. Robinson to feel that the vaccine was important. He also indicated several years later that at one point in her experience, besides Ellen White's staff receiving a vaccine for smallpox, that Ellen White herself also decided to have a vaccine for smallpox. So this is just a little summary overview of some information that might be helpful. But I want to reemphasize that Ellen White did not receive specific revelation from God on this issue, even though she did have lots of things that she was shown on the issues of health in other areas.
Thank you so much for that historical perspective. Now, Dr. Landless, can you share the current position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church as it relates to vaccinations?
Thank you, Milan. What a pleasure to be with you. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has been blessed with a health message. It is a gift by a gracious God to a church given a message to proclaim to a broken world. And yes, we do have a statement on vaccines. Our health message is founded on the Bible. It's informed by the spirit of prophecy and is consonant to a large extent with a robust amount of peer-reviewed, evidence-based health science. So yes, we do have a statement which is in favor of responsible immunization. You know, if you look at what has prolonged life, as a cardiologist, I'm not going to tell you it's heart transplantation. I'll tell you it's healthful living. It is sanitation. It is clean water. And what has added to the longevity of those two basic factors has been immunization. So we encourage responsible immunization and have no religious or faith-based reason not to encourage it. And so it encourages herd immunity or community immunity, sounds so much better, but is very much the individual's choice. We are not the conscience of the church member. However, we very much respect, and we all should respectfully take into account individual choice in this matter.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for that. And you covered, in between those two questions, you guys have covered a lot of ground. So I actually, I want to get to something that I know a lot of viewers, or we received questions on this topic, and we know it's on a lot of viewers' minds. And this question I want to direct it toward Pastor Finley. There are some lines of thought linking the Adventist lifestyle and the Adventist message and theology to as a determining factor as to whether or not to take the vaccine. As in, if I follow Adventism, the lifestyle, if I am a good Adventist, I do not need to take the vaccine. And some may even take it a little further and link it to salvation and say, if I take the vaccine, not only am I demonstrating a lack of faith, I am inheriting the mark of the beast. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would respond in a couple ways to that question. First, I want to reinforce what Dr. Landless said. If you look at the Bible, Romans 14, verse 5, relating to a different topic, but really the same principle, says, let every person be persuaded in their own mind. Freedom of choice is absolutely critical. The Seventh-day Adventist Church does not mandate what individuals do regarding their health when it comes to vaccines. That's a matter of individual choice. I think that's a biblical principle. The second principle, I believe, is the unity of the church. In John 17, Jesus prayed that his people be one. If a person chooses to take the vaccine, that's a personal choice that they make. If a person chooses not to, but to use that to have vaccine wars in the church is indeed a conflict of Christian values and principles. I think the third thing is tolerance. If I believe that another should respect my choice, the Christian ethic says I should respect their choice. So tolerance means that not only do I expect people to respect my choice, but I respect their choice. Then you asked about the subject of the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast has absolutely nothing to do with vaccines. Let me make that 100% clear. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 and 7, where we have the three angels' messages, in verse 7, in the light of the judgment, we're called to worship the Creator. Seventh-day Adventists understand the essence of the great controversy to be over the issue of worship, worshiping the Creator. Verse 9 says, don't worship the beast. Verse 12 says, keep the commandments of God. So Seventh-day Adventists understand that there's a conflict over the law of God, the character of God, and that in the light of a people saved by grace, they'll respond to keeping God's commandments. The idea that one can embed in the vaccine something that will change the DNA and that is receiving the mark of the beast, there's two major problems with that. One, it's not scientific, and two, it is certainly not theological. We see the mark of the beast issue over worship. I think the last thing I'd want to say about this whole subject is when you think about whether you should get the vaccine or you shouldn't, as we mentioned, that's a very personal choice. But I think if one thinks only of themselves, that can be a selfish choice. We need to be thinking about not only of me, but my community. How does my decision, whatever I personally choose to make, impact elderly parents? How does it impact my son, my daughter, my aunts, my uncles? How does it impact the larger community? So the Christian ethic calls us to be considerate to the larger community based on Jesus' principle, love your neighbor as yourself.
Wonderful. And I like what you said, Pastor Finley, about how this shouldn't be a divisive topic, especially among a community of believers. So I'm wondering, Dr. Burt, have there been other examples in Adventist history where we may have seen something like this, where something from the public or affecting national discourse? Has a reaction like this been seen from the Adventist Church, or is this unprecedented?
Well, I'm not sure that I can speak to that necessarily, but I can think of another example as it relates to Ellen White's experience, because I know for Seventh-day Adventists, they are interested in understanding that particular issue and sometimes think that they are being unfaithful to God's leading through the messages that she has given if they take a vaccine or have a vaccine. And there's a principle that I think is very important to consider, and that is something that she herself said, and I quote her from Third Selected Messages 217. God wants us all to have common sense, and he wants us to reason from common sense. Circumstances alter conditions. Circumstances change the relation of things. And I think of the story of what happened in connection with quinine and in our church. Early in her experience, mercury and quinine and other very toxic drugs were used without clear scientific basis, and some of them don't have scientific basis. But it was found some years later that quinine actually did have some real scientific effect or was demonstrated scientifically to help with malaria. And in the 1890s, when they were in Australia, a man who was working in the islands decided not to allow quinine to be used for his son, his firstborn son, who had contracted malaria and was very, very ill from it, because of his feeling that this would not be right to do. And tragically, his son died. Later, when he was in Australia and talked to Ellen White about this, W.C. White reported on the meeting, and he reportedly asked her, would I have sinned to give my boy quinine when I knew of no other way to check the malaria, and when the prospect was that he would die without it? And Ellen White replied and said, no, we are expected to do the best we can. So this principle of using sanctified common sense and being aware of circumstances is an important factor that I think we learn from history, from our history.
Wow. And I have one more question. You know, our time flies, so we could spend, hours on this topic. But Dr. Landless, I have this last question for you. When considering respecting personal choice, one question comes to mind for a lot of people, people who genuinely want to know more about the vaccine, but have a hesitancy for whatever reason. And they weigh whether it's best to get the vaccine and perhaps get side effects, or would getting the actual virus, like which would be worse, or, so people kind of wait and see, or not wait and see, but that's a decision that a lot of people hold and carry. What would you say to that?
Well, I deeply empathize and sympathize with people who have questions and concerns. All thinking people have questions and concerns. But responding to the question you have just raised, looking at what the benefits versus the risks are, we see that the risks of dying with COVID are very high. When you look at what has happened across the world, in 15 months, 16 months, 3.3+ million people have died from COVID. When we look at the long haulers and the effects that come, and we are learning more and more every day what the side effects are of COVID, the long-term issues, we're seeing tremendous problems, neurological, musculoskeletal, autoimmune, many of these issues, clots, thrombosis, and of course people realize that there are risks to the vaccine, and there are risks to the vaccine. Most of those risks are minor side effects. There have been recorded directly causal related deaths, a small percentage, a very small group. There were 15, 16, which have been very carefully studied on the clotting related to the J&J vaccine. So yes, we need to be cognizant of risks, but to realize that one of the most serious side effects of COVID is death. Another serious side effect is the long-term effects, which are becoming more and more understood as time goes by. So we need to look at risk versus benefit. What we have seen in countries where there has been a successful rollout of immunization, case numbers have dropped, hospitalizations have dropped, the ability to be able to manage life has improved significantly, and we are looking at significant benefits so far, looking at risk to benefit ratio.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landless. And we're going to bring our discussion with this panel to a close. But don't worry, we will be able to see Dr. Landless again later in our program when we have our question and answer segment. So I want to thank you, Dr. Burt. Thank you, Pastor Finley, and thank you, Dr. Landless, again for lending your time and your expertise on this very important issue. Thank you so much. Now we will bring Jacqueline Perlman back on. We'll get to hear the rest of her testimony. Jacqueline, it's good to have you back.
Thank you. I apologize. I don't know what happened, but as I was saying, I'm going to pick up from where I left off. It was Sabbath. It was a Sabbath in April of 2020 when I woke up with the classic COVID symptoms, chills, fever, body ache, muscle ache, headache, like I had never experienced before. And I described it to the physicians as animals eating and chewing my brain. I was restless that Sabbath, asking God if COVID had attacked me like a thief in the night. I went to the CDU that evening. I kept saying that I was air hungry and I could not breathe, but I was told that my oxygen saturation was 95 to 96 and the numbers looked great. I had no fever, and that's because I had taken Tylenol before getting to the CDU. I was discharged a few hours later with a diagnosis of UTI, and as I drove home, I had chills and started having hallucinations, but I was able to get home and immediately isolated from my family. I checked my temperature, which was 103.4, and I knew what I had was something very different and perplexing. My condition kept worsening, and the fear and anxiety was at an all-time high. By Tuesday morning, when my husband came to check on me, he had the look of fear on his face. He asked me about calling 911, but I did not want to get in an ambulance, as I knew that they would take me to the closest hospital and not to the hospital of my choice. He is so faithful. As my husband drove with me laying in the back seat of the car to get onto the beltway, an ambulance appeared out of nowhere with lights and sirens on. He followed that ambulance, which led him right to the ER of that hospital. And he later shared with me when that ambulance stopped by the ER, the EMS crew got out. There was no patient in the ambulance. They opened the ambulance doors, and folks in full PPE gear that were standing outside the ER sprayed the ambulance down. And, you know, I sincerely believe it was the angels that were sent down from heaven to guide my husband's car on the beltway straight to the ER. In the ER, my COVID test was positive, and I was told that I was very, very ill. The hallucinations continued in the hospital, and when there were periods of mental clarity, all I could think of was my family, my life. Will I die? Will I go to heaven? And just prayers. There were times when I was almost certain it was the end for me. I lost the ability to speak. My organs were shutting down. The fever would not break. The IV fluids, triple antibiotics, morphine, Lovenox, nausea meds were doing little to help. My oxygen saturations would drop with any slight movement. Initially, I had asked the doctors to save me, but I believe by the third day or so, that changed. The physician who I knew personally and was in charge of my care would come to my room several times a day. And each time he would say to me, you know, you're not going to die on my watch. I will do everything I can to save you. The staff, along with the doctors, knew of my faith from a lot of the Brinklow church members who would call and pray for me, as well as for my husband. And although the physician and I were not of the same faith, he would tell me how, you know, he said a prayer for me and to hold on, and God's not done with me. I was beyond blessed by the care of the doctors and nurses, and the nurses would sing and pray for me. There are so many stories that till this day I am amazed, and I have no doubt that those nurses were angels sent from above to provide me the care that I received. As I was leaving the unit on Mother's Day, I was informed that there were several other nurses and physicians who were admitted before me, but I was the first one to discharge. And for that, I say, thank you, Lord, for the hem of his garment and for making me whole. Before I close, I would also like to point out the impact of the pandemic surrounding mental health. We should not be ashamed to prioritize mental health and well-being. I believe we should be fostering authentic conversations on mental health and wellness. We need to be deliberate in having open conversations. And I will share with you today, the mental health burden was real and present for me, but I was also very blessed to be surrounded by a spouse and friends who understood and prioritized my emotional well-being. As I reflect on my experience and the events of the past year in our country, around the world, and what is currently happening in India, the numerous loss of lives as a result of the virus, how grateful I am to God for sparing me. And I have no doubt he is still working in me and through me, and he's not done with me yet.
Amen. Amen. Wow, Jacqueline, what a powerful story. And thank God for keeping you and sustaining you through that time. Thank you so much again for telling your testimony. And now we will transition to our second panel discussion.
Milan, thank you for that informative discussion. I know I learned something, and I pray our viewers did as well. I would now like to introduce our second panel of experts who will discuss the science behind vaccines and how they are developed. They will also answer some questions relative to the role governments play in vaccine creation and development, and hopefully dispel some of the specific myths surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine.
Our guests for our second panel are Cassandra McNulty, a public health professional, Dr. Stephen Smith from Advent Health, who was involved in the development of one of the variants of the COVID vaccine. And also joining us from Advent Health is internal medicine specialist, Dr. Vincent Hsu. Milan, our first question for your guest is this. Can you please explain the basic science behind a vaccine? And does that differ from some of the variants of the current COVID vaccines?
Yes, Roy, that's something that's heavy on everyone's minds. What goes into a vaccine? I'm so glad we have Dr. Hsu here to give us sort of like a vaccine 101. So Dr. Hsu, what goes inside those vaccinations?
Thank you very much, Milan. Vaccines are what we've heard about every day. We've had them as kids. These are materials that stimulate your immune system to produce antibodies. And the traditional methods for making vaccines have always included the organism itself. It was either killed or it was a weakened version so it didn't cause the disease. Some newer vaccines would contain particles of those vaccines, the proteins that were given. And again, the whole purpose of these vaccines were to stimulate the body that would recognize these particles and cause your immune system to create antibodies. That is the whole purpose that's how vaccines work. Now we have newer technologies and we have using genetic material that stimulates your own cells to make these viral proteins that will cause the antibodies to be made. But it's all really being done the same way. Antibodies are being made. So the most recent vaccines do contain some genetic material. There is what we call lipid layer to surround the mRNA, the genetic material. But really, that's the main component of a vaccine. And I just want to make sure that we understand, why we're doing this. Why are vaccines out there? And that's because what we want to try to do is to prevent disease. We want to save lives. I know this is a very personal decision for all of us. We all need to make an informed decision. So that's why we are here to tell you about how these vaccines are made. I still, as a practicing physician, I'm an infectious disease doctor. I still see COVID cases in the hospital. And currently, all of these cases that are occurring are in people who have not received the vaccine. So again, that is why we are making vaccines. We want to save lives. And that's why we're encouraging all of you to get vaccinated to protect yourself. And of course, not to spread it to others.
And so why do vaccines cause side effects? The soreness in the arm, sometimes a fever or chills. Something so good as this vaccine, why does it sometimes make us feel not so good?
Well, I mean, side effects have always been part of the history of vaccinations, but they have been very mild overall, and they've been very quite limited. And Dr. Landless previously had spoken about some of the reasons that we have these and that they're very mild. Many don't have any side effects at all. Some of them historically were due to impurities in the vaccines. Those have largely been taken care of with newer vaccines. But the most important side effect that people might experience are what we call the immune system being primed or reacting. And these are things such as headaches, fever, feeling out of the weather. You're kind of feeling like you're infected, with a cold. And that is really the point. Your body is actually creating those antibodies. It is fighting these, invaders in the form of vaccine. It doesn't cause the disease, but you do feel under the weather. And in some sense, to get these side effects is actually a sign that your immune system is working. Other side effects that are very common include soreness of the arm. And yes, there are significant, very, very rare, but significant side effects. Some of these include severe allergic reactions. There could be autoimmune reactions, and you've heard of the Johnson & Johnson blood clots that have occurred, which could be autoimmune. Those are rare, but they do occur, and we want to make sure that everyone is aware of these to make your own decisions. But again, when you're talking about risks and benefits, and Dr. Landless mentioned this in the previous segment, it is what are the risks of getting vaccinated versus the risk of not getting vaccinated and potentially getting COVID and all the things that go along with that. I mean, it's something you have to decide, but I think most people would say, I would really like to take the risk of vaccines. It's very mild, it's very small, and weigh that against the risk of getting COVID.
Yeah. And Dr. Smith, Dr. Hsu earlier mentioned the mRNA technology. That is definitely a term that we've seen floating around, but what does that mean exactly? And how was that technology used to create the COVID-19 vaccines that are available today?
So this has been a broad and wide discussion. Let me just re-emphasize something that Dr. Hsu said a few minutes ago, and that is that these new vaccines have some genetic material. mRNA is the genetic material in the Pfizer and also in the Moderna vaccine. That mRNA is taken up by cells in the immune system. Proteins are made inside the body, in the lymph nodes actually, and those proteins stimulate the immune system to create antibodies and to turn the immune system, other cells called T cells and B cells, to turn them on so that they fight the virus if you get exposed or infected. Now, this is a newer technology, but it's not brand new. The development of these mRNA vaccines has been going on for a decade. They have some real advantages. One advantage is that they can be customized and made very quickly. So the reason that the first two vaccines that came out were Pfizer and Moderna is because of that technology. And that development had been going on for about a decade. And this technology was actually designed to be used, for example, for a better flu vaccine that can be customized in a matter of weeks, as opposed to months and months that it takes to make a new flu vaccine. So it's not a new technology. It's the first time that it's been used at this scale. And I think that's an important thing for us to pay attention to. It's not brand new. It's just the first time it's been used at this scale.
I appreciate the term you used, customization, and I want to make sure this is emphasized. This technology, as Dr. Smith said, is not new. It's been around for a decade, but it's kind of like the plug and play once you have that genetic code of the SARS-CoV-2, correct?
That's right.
You put in that code into the sequence. So aside from the the implication of this was rushed for those who may not have understood or known about that decade-long research. Aside from that, what other misconceptions are out there about the COVID-19 vaccine?
I think people we've heard talk about this would say that there were shortcuts and that the process by which these were developed was somehow rushed and that there were shortcuts. And I can say this, we have a scientific review committee that has looked at all of the different vaccines that we've talked about here this afternoon. And the vaccine was made very quickly because that technology allows it to be made quickly. But the trials actually were in many ways larger and longer than some of the flu vaccine trials that have been conducted in the past. There were no shortcuts. The same regulatory environment for how the trials are conducted was kept, and it's the same as it was for other vaccines in the past. And I can say this from the inside. You mentioned earlier that we did conduct the J&J Janssen vaccine trial. We're still studying and following those people who got the vaccine, and there were no shortcuts. The same regulatory environment was in place. We did all the same paperwork. We made all the same training, and everything really was the same as it would be. It's just that people showed up and volunteered by the thousands and thousands to participate in these trials because of the need for the world. And so we're very pleased to have been part of that. And that inside look gives me confidence that there were no corners that were cut.
So we were poised, or the scientific community was poised to respond to this need with the existing technology, but then also with the people who volunteered to be part of this trial. So that's why we were able to get it so quickly. But you're the perfect person, to ask about the Johnson & Johnson pause that we saw about a month ago that, raised some concern, but that vaccine is preferred by a lot of people because it's only one shot.
That's right.
So what happened there? Why was it paused, and can it still be trusted?
Yeah, so there were cases that you heard a few minutes ago of very rare instances where people develop blood clots that are very serious. These blood clots were identified a variety of different ways, but mostly with what's called our surveillance system. And the surveillance system is designed here in the US so that we can see if there are adverse effects of the vaccine after it's released into the public. In these surveillance systems, there's actually more than one, we're able to identify these very rare, very uncommon side effects. And I think one thing to note is that the system worked. It had actually been in place for flu vaccines, had not really been used at this scale in this period of time. And I've been very impressed with the way that these very rare cases were picked up by that system. And we've been able to learn more about this because of that. I would say, and I have friends of mine who have been recently vaccinated and wanted to take the Janssen vaccine because it's one shot. The other thing I would say is that the adverse effects, the ones that Dr. Hsu was talking about, tend to be a little bit less with the Janssen vaccine. And for people who are concerned about that, that's an important consideration as well.
Yes, absolutely. Cassandra, how has the rollout of these vaccinations, under the umbrella of the COVID-19 vaccine, how has the rollout differed from other vaccines? And along the same lines, how is the public's response to this vaccine? How has it differed from responses to other vaccines?
Good question. When thinking about that, I think I could probably talk for hours about the history of vaccine rollouts. And one of the conclusions we can make from vaccine rollouts historically is the human experience with the disease a lot of times impacts the rollout and the acceptance of the vaccine by the population. And so as a result, a lot of the different vaccine rollouts historically have had different trajectories. I was a young person when HPV vaccine was rolled out. And then I was in grad school with enough time to be able to start studying provider and the public response to it and the acceptance to it. And so that's very much our conclusion. I think too, I would be remiss if I didn't say that social media and the access to different types of information, both scientific, medical, public media, and also people's opinions, is very different with this rollout than we've ever seen before, just because technology has advanced so drastically. And so I think that hesitancy is, people are more aware of hesitancy in different populations that are hesitant. Based on what Dr. Smith was sharing, I think too, one of my conclusions on this rollout was very similar to his, in that I look historically at the different vaccine rollouts and I realize that our surveillance systems work. We saw that with rotavirus, we saw that with oral polio, we saw that with yellow fever, and that when we roll out a vaccine, we don't just roll it out to the public and say, here you go, here's your vaccine, we hope it works for you. We are diligent about tracking and collecting the data, and that data is not just collected through VAERS, Dr. Smith was talking about, but it's also collected from other countries and their cohorts from vaccines that they're administering in those countries. Recently, they've been administering phase 4 trials. So after it's administered to the population, they're continuing the study and collecting the information. So I would say that one of the things that's very different about this rollout is the fact that in real time, we can see that our surveillance systems are working, that these vaccines are safe, and that if anything comes up and it's not safe, we're going to know immediately, and we can find assurance in that.
Wow, yeah, because the surveillance system is something that I wasn't fully aware of, but when you mentioned that now, you and Dr. Smith, that is a reassuring or an assuring thing to know. But you mentioned something very relevant, Cassandra, about social media and just how awareness, like there's more conversation and we're more aware of all this conversation. But how about conversations from experts to the public? So what role do healthcare workers, what role do they play in educating the public on fact versus myth?
I would say it's an incredibly important role. I want to be clear that I'm not a provider. I work in the healthcare field. I work in operations and administration on the ground in a health center. And so what I can say is the statistics and the data that we've seen in the past decades around provider influence is absolutely true. And that is that the single most influential factor in a decision for a parent or family to take a vaccine is a provider recommendation. And so that means there's a lot of responsibility on providers. The public is putting a lot of trust. And so I think that there are some things that we need to keep in mind. One is we need to be prepared. We need to know the information and feel comfortable communicating that information to the patients. I think that we have to make sure that we, especially because this is a novel virus, we need to make sure that we are communicating that we don't have it all figured out. I've realized that when we're trying to communicate from a posture of authority and that we know it all, we break trust with patients. We need to be able to come down to their level and communicate, what are we confident in? What do we know 100%? What do we think we know, but we're still studying? It could change, it could shift. And what do we not know yet? What are we still studying? Because what I've observed and what I realize is when new recommendations come out or things change, then patients start thinking that they don't know what they're talking about, they're switching directions, this isn't working, without realizing it's the scientific method. That we are testing and we are learning, and the more that we learn, we adjust and we get that information out in real time and make sure that people know, oh, we just found this out, we need to shift lanes just a little bit, or adjust here just a little bit. But it doesn't mean that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it doesn't mean that science and medicine doesn't know what they're talking about. But I think in order for patients to understand that, we have to be able to communicate where our knowledge ends and where we're still learning. And then lastly, I want to make sure, and I think it's very important, that we are not coming from a position of us versus them. This is a hard decision. It's a really, really hard decision for families. And I believe that not one person is making this decision whether to take the vaccine or not take the vaccine in order to hurt somebody. And so what I find is helpful is to come with a posture of empathy and curiosity, asking questions and trying to understand why someone is making the decision that they are, creating an environment that's safe to ask questions, because really we're only going to get through this together, and we need to be able to have those conversations that play a key role really in helping patients to navigate this.
Empathy, and curiosity. I like that combination. I like that a lot. Dr. Smith, we got a question in from our live audience asking about the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is available in Canada, I believe. And what's the difference between that vaccine and the vaccines that are available in the United States?
Yeah, so the AstraZeneca vaccine is very similar to the J&J Janssen vaccine. It carries DNA as the genetic material that tells the body to make proteins to turn on the antibody production, as Dr. Xu was talking about. That has had a lot of exploration in the post-marketing space throughout Europe. It was developed in the UK, and that vaccine has been implemented and tested across the UK. And again, their surveillance program has been very clear that the benefits outweigh the risks in that case as well. It's, again, very similar to the J&J vaccine. One thing I'd like to follow up on that was mentioned a few minutes ago, and that was, the time to be able to make slight modifications in the mRNA vaccines, but also these other two vaccine methodologies, or these other two vaccines with that DNA-based methodology. As we see these new variants of COVID come out, we're going to be able to rapidly adjust. In fact, all the way back in January, both Pfizer and Moderna were making new sequences, that little code that gets put in there to specifically fight some of these more aggressive strains. And we're going to, I think, be very grateful for that if we need to later in the future have boosters, that they're going to be ready for us to very rapidly adapt. It takes months and months and months for a flu vaccine to be developed before it actually is released. And these viruses can change very rapidly. So that's an important component. And I predict in the future, these technologies will be used very soon for flu and for other kinds of vaccines where we're constantly having to update them on a regular basis.
Thank you for that. And as I suspected would happen, this segment is generating lots of questions with our online audience. So Dr. Xu, one just came in about people who have contracted COVID-19 and are on the opposite side of it. They're also being encouraged to take the vaccine. What about those who may find that pointless, or, just walk me through the benefits or the pros and cons of someone who's already gone through or had COVID-19 to then get the vaccine as well?
One thing we've learned about this disease, and we're learning more about this every day as we're going along, is that the immunity to this specific disease, the COVID-19, is really quite variable. I mean, people get very mild symptoms or no symptoms at all when they get infected. Others have severe infections. And some people develop significant antibody reactions, and they're very positive. They have high quantities of antibodies. Others don't make much antibodies at all. And what we're finding is that, it depends upon the type of the person, or perhaps the type of disease they had, So and we also know that the immunity that we have from this disease wanes over time. So it wanes at different levels depending upon how severe disease or how healthy or immunocompromised individual is. So it's really all across the board in terms of how long this immunity could last. It could be as little as 3 months in some. Others could have immunity for well over a year. So as a result, because we do know that some patients may not develop significant immunity even after getting COVID, the recommendations are get your vaccine. And getting a standard dose of vaccine provides a more standardized response for the body to respond to that. And we'll have better understandings about that as we keep moving forward. There may be a need for a booster vaccine at some point. That hasn't been made public, or we're not too certain exactly how that's going to occur if it does. But the important thing is to make sure that we do get that vaccine, even if you had COVID, because of the fact that patients have different types of immunities that occur with COVID infection. So we want to make sure that everyone is covered.
Yes, and speaking of immunities, Cassandra, I wanted to get you to discuss and explain herd immunity. That's also something that we've heard, like buzzwords. What exactly does that mean? Why is it important? And when do you think we'll get there?
That is a great question. So there are two reasons why we want to take a vaccine. One is for personal health, or personal protection, and the other is to reach herd immunity. And that basically is reaching the level of immunity within our population so that COVID can no longer spread easily among the community. And why is that important? Well, we have people in our population. We've got babies, we've got the chronically ill, we have those that can't even take a vaccine. Even the elderly that don't mount a good immune response, even if they are able to take the vaccine, that they count on the herd. They count on their community to protect them, to keep that disease from spreading. And that's a concept that is applicable to all of our diseases, all of the vaccines that we prevent disease with. And so we are able to achieve that immunity either through that natural immunity that Dr. Hsu was talking about, or being vaccinated. And so right now, your last question, where do we need, what threshold do we need to achieve? I was just listening to a podcast with Dr. Paul Offit, and he says, in his opinion, it's 80%. I have heard different vaccinologists and immunologists say different levels, but let's just say 80%. If that's what we need, then where are we at? Where are we anywhere close? And the answer is it's complicated. And it's complicated partly because of some of the things that Dr. Hsu was talking about, but because we have a lot of different groups that are at different places of immunity and ability to achieve immunity. So we have right now children and infants who are not approved for the vaccine, that are not eligible. Some may be naturally immune because they have been exposed or had COVID, and some not. We have those that are knowing or unknowingly immune naturally through COVID. We have the vaccinated group of people. I just saw this morning, the data that I saw was 36% of eligible Americans are fully vaccinated with 2 doses, and 47% of eligible Americans have received 1 dose. So we're heading there, we're getting there. We have some 500,000 to 1 million who cannot be vaccinated due to their chronic health conditions. They're receiving chemotherapy, biologics for other chronic diseases. And then we have the percent that don't want to be vaccinated, and they can also be in one of those other groups. And so because it's really hard for us to classify people and add it all up, it's really hard to know if we've gotten there yet. But what I can say is I'm confident we are going to get there if we work together. We have 2 great vaccines, and I think I'm also very confident in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And I think that if we are able to work together, we will be able to achieve that level of herd immunity. I think that we also need to keep in mind, though, that COVID cannot be eliminated. It's not the type of disease that we're going to be able to eliminate from the earth. It's something that can be controlled. So we're not going to have a post-COVID era. We're going to have a COVID-controlled era because we are a global community and we travel and we move around until there are all the countries in the world who have controlled COVID, we are going to be actively controlling and vaccinating in order to ensure that it's not moving around in our population. That's why we still give polio. We don't have polio around spreading within the United States, but there's still polio in the world. Same thing with measles. Typically, measles wasn't spreading and moving around in the United States, but as people stopped vaccinating, we started to see outbreaks. And so that's what happens when we reach herd immunity, but then we stop vaccinating or stop the controls, we start to see those outbreaks again. And so I think that we will get there. I can't tell you on what time frame. I don't think any scientist or researcher is going to try and name a date. We put timelines on it and then we push them. And so I'm not going to sit here and tell you when we're going to get there. But I will say that I think that if we all come together, we will be able to make this happen.
Togetherness is a theme that has been all throughout this panel, and I really appreciate that. It really takes a selflessness mentality to gain a complete understanding of this topic. Dr. Smith, we've also been getting questions about the specifics of this vaccine in terms of its ingredients. You know, you mentioned the mRNA, but is the COVID-19 virus mixed up in the mRNA? Is the virus, when we get the vaccine, are we getting a snippet of the virus?
We're getting a snippet, but not the whole virus. And I think that's important to understand. It's just part of the genetic code that tells our body to make up one single protein that then develops those antibodies. And I think that's important. There is no coronavirus in any of the vaccines that we have today. Again, like Dr. Hsu said, in the past, we used to grow viruses in the Petri dish, kill them or reduce their infectivity, their potency, so to speak, and then give them to people. This avoids all the problems of some of those attenuated or live viruses. One thing I'd like to just very briefly say that Cassandra touched on, and that's about why people get vaccines. Why would you want to get a vaccine if you haven't already? And the one I think people gravitate to is about me and I. You know, why would I want to get a vaccine? To protect my own health? But we have to remember, if we love our family members, if we love our community enough to try to help others, those are other very good reasons to get a vaccine, and can motivate many people, particularly young people who themselves don't have high risk. They have some risk of developing complications of COVID or dying. But I don't want to be the person who gives a friend, a colleague, somebody in the community COVID, and then they have a serious complication. That's really, for me, about loving others and about being part of a community. And I think that's an important consideration for all of us.
Given the interest, as I mentioned before, of this session, we've been granted a little more time because we want to answer one question in particular that just came in. Have there been, and Dr. Hsu or Dr. Smith, you can take this one, have there been any fatalities related to the COVID-19 vaccine?
So there was one fatality that I'm aware of that was associated with the Janssen vaccine. As far as I'm aware, Dr. Hsu, with the Pfizer and Moderna, I don't think there have been any fatalities associated with them. Could you comment on that?
There are no fatalities that I'm aware with the mRNA vaccines. There were some, 2 or 3 related to the blood clots that occurred that could be attributed to the vaccine. And I want to let you know, of course, we talked about VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Providers and patients are encouraged to always put in any type of adverse event that they think might be occurring from the vaccine. And so as a result, there have been reports of deaths, there have been reports of other adverse events that have occurred. But those are being scrutinized very carefully. Just because a death was recorded that occurred after the vaccine does not mean that the vaccine caused the death. And so there's a lot of analysis needs to be looked into this. But yes, I mean, I've not heard of anything specific to the mRNA vaccines as far as deaths are concerned.
And we actually see this in our clinical studies, the trials with these vaccines. We had a patient in one of our Orlando hospitals that became very ill, was admitted to the hospital, had symptoms that many thought were related to the vaccine. It turns out they received the placebo. So you have to compare all the data. You can't take just one little snippet of data. You have to look at the totality. And again, the risk-benefit ratio here. COVID's killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and the vaccines, it's a pretty easy calculation to be able to make. But I do understand the concerns. Again, think about your family and your community, and put yourself last in this. That's I think can be very helpful.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for your time and your expertise and the clarity in which you spoke with to explain a very complicated scientific process. Cassandra, you mentioned the scientific method for those who are not scientists. We haven't revisited that since grade school, but thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And now we are going to prepare for our next panel.
Milan, thank you for helping us better understand the science behind vaccines, and especially how the current COVID vaccines were developed. The next group of experts will help us understand the role vaccines play in helping us stay healthy, as well as the critical role that leading a healthy lifestyle benefits whole person health.
The experts for this panel are Dr. David Williams, Chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health; Dr. Andrew Catanzaro, Infectious Diseases Specialist at Adventist Healthcare; and India Medley, the Chief Nursing Officer for Howard University Hospital. Milan, the first question we would like our panelists to answer is, why are vaccines an important component of community health?
Thank you so much, Roy. I would like to point that question toward Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams, how do vaccination rates contribute to the health of a community?
Thanks so much. It's good to be here. Vaccines are very, very important to the health of a community. You see, if you get vaccinated and you are protected because of the vaccine, you've protected yourself. But importantly, as was just emphasized in the last panel, you no longer spread it to others. So you are benefiting the community. The more people that's vaccinated, there are fewer opportunities for the disease to spread. If a few people get vaccinated, what can happen? Just with one or two people coming into the community, we can have a large outbreak. And in the United States, we have had large outbreaks of measles, for example, in recent years, just because of one or two people coming from outside of the United States, bringing it into a community where few people were in fact vaccinated. So the other point that I think we never even think about, when a community has a high rate of vaccinated, we are actually protecting the economy of the state, of that community, of that city, and that's another thing that we often don't think of. Let me give you one concrete example, and there's been a recent study just published in a medical journal earlier this month, looking carefully at the success of the state of Israel in terms of COVID-19 vaccines. They have done a great job in terms of having a very high level of vaccination in the population. And what it has been shown, as a result of the high level of vaccination, there's been reduced infections, there's been reduced COVID-19 hospitalizations, there has been reduced cases, the rates of severe disease, and the reduced number of deaths. So as vaccine coverage increased, all of those benefits were also evident.
Wow, the economy, that's definitely something that hasn't been on my radar in terms of something like the impact of the virus and how the virus is handled and how vaccines are carried out. Dr. Catanzaro, the development of vaccines and vaccinations are a huge role in what you do in your field of infectious diseases. Can you share specific examples from experiences from your work?
Sure. So since vaccines have been developed over 50 years, we've seen a decrease in the number of infections that are in our community, and that I've seen in my. So for example, since the advent of the measles, the mumps, the rubella vaccine, the polio vaccine, during my career, I've only read about these diseases. I've never actually seen any cases. And of course, the same is true for smallpox. So just over my lifetime, we've seen the control in the United States and many parts of the world, in the developing world and in the underdeveloped world, the control of infections that have been coming to us as human beings for thousands and thousands of years. One specific example for the coronavirus vaccine, we as healthcare workers were vaccinated very early in the availability of the vaccine. And so one of my colleagues who was vaccinated, she's a nurse, an ER nurse, her husband and her son both contracted coronavirus. And unbeknownst to her, they had the infection, but she decided to test herself, and she had been fully vaccinated, and she never got the infection. And so these kind of individual anecdotes of even though an entire family could get COVID, that this vaccine could protect an individual are really very powerful.
And Dr. Medley, this pandemic has deepened or exposed what many have already known, especially in the healthcare field, of disparities of healthcare accessibility. And so with that in mind, can you list specific disparities that were heightened or deepened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, thank you, Milan. I am working on the front lines each and every day during this pandemic. And it is very, very obvious to me and prevalent within our hospital at Howard University Hospital in Washington, D.C., how prevalent this virus is and how it affects many people, especially minorities, Black, African Americans, Latinos, and folk from our Native American communities. Within our hospital, which is predominantly Black, African American, we saw it quite consistently and frequently. And so it was very important to us, and is very important to us, that we're providing the best care. And that first and foremost, we are protecting and taking very good care of ourselves, that we are following the CDC recommendations for PPE, hand hygiene, and vaccinations, so that we're not spreading it to our patients and to our families. And that we are actually, as healthcare providers, modeling, demonstrating, sharing what we know to be the best science, so that our patients will get better and stronger and be able to be discharged when they go home to their communities.
Dr. Williams, have you seen various examples from your position, or just trends that you've noticed about various ways that healthcare workers are attempting to fill that gap when we speak about the healthcare disparities?
Yes, there are large disparities in health, and COVID-19 didn't create them, but I think it has shown a bright light on some of the disparities that have in fact existed for a long time. And as my colleague just said, populations of color in the United States, including Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, is another population that all have rates of death from COVID-19 that are twice as high. And the United States as a whole still leads the world in the number of COVID-19 deaths. And many people don't realize, and when we do these risk-benefit calculations, that the risk even of those persons Johnson who died from the vaccine, your risk of getting COVID-19 is much higher than that, and your risk of actually dying from COVID-19 is much higher than the risk of the 7 women who got these serious blood clots from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So I would say that as we do the risk-benefit ratio, let's not trivialize how serious a problem COVID-19 is. Let me put it this way. For decades now, the number 1 cause of death in the United States has been heart disease. The number 2 has been cancer. Since November of last year through about February, March, COVID-19 was killing more Americans every day than heart disease or cancer. So this is a huge problem, and we need to take it really very seriously. The other point that's really important to keep in mind as we think of the disparities is that as we think of COVID-19, and we certainly getting the vaccine is a powerful and important potential strategy to reduce risk at a community level, but we also should go back to the Adventist roots of a healthy lifestyle. And you think of the 8 laws of health, and following those 8 laws of health in fact help build our immune system. And to the extent that we have a healthy immune system, we can be protected. But we should also keep in mind that the ministry of healing reminds us that we should, even when we pray to God and we do everything we know we can, we should make use of all the agencies that God has provided to support health. So the fact that I am living healthy and following the 8 laws of health, but the vaccine is a resource, I can add that to the strategies I am using to, in fact, improve health and to reduce inequities in health in the United States.
Thank you so much for that, because that was a question or comment I was going to pose to each of you to get your take, because I know from reviewing your work and your passions that taking a holistic view of health and healthcare is very important to you and your line of work. So I wanted to get Dr. Catanzaro and Dr. Medley to also share their perspective on what are the benefits of taking a holistic approach when it comes to one's health, but also in regards to vaccines. So in other words, not just focusing on physical, like eating right and exercise, not just focusing on mental, but taking a whole, a big picture look, and then where do vaccines fit into that picture? So Dr. Catanzaro, can you answer that first?
Sure, well, I agree with you. Taking a big picture look is very beneficial, because you really have to consider all of your health when you're making some of these decisions. And many people do ask me, how will this vaccine affect my overall health? Well, I think we should be very honest. The first couple of days after getting vaccines, some of us may get side effects, and some of those side effects may be very frightening. The appearance of a fever, fatigue, those are real side effects. And so I think educating yourself about what you might anticipate, and maybe taking a lighter load that next day so that you can be physically and mentally prepared for some of those side effects. When we vaccinated a lot of our workforce, there were a number of people who had to go home that day with a chill and rest up so that they could be ready in the coming days to feel better and better equipped to be back to present to those who needed them. So those components, I think, are essential when you're getting a vaccine and planning to get a vaccine, and you're thinking about a vaccine. These are, I also get a lot of questions about long-term side effects from these vaccines. And the reality is that the majority of side effects that are going to happen in the very first week or two at most after vaccination. And that's true with almost all vaccines that we have. There are very, very rare vaccines that have any long-term implications for people's health. And that's been studied extensively. This vaccine, they also did very specific studies to look at the immune system to see if it's stimulated in incorrect ways. And the good news is that it's not stimulating the immune system in incorrect ways. So I think as we look at wholeness and the whole body, really this is a way to protect ourselves against a virus that will attack the whole body. This virus attacks not only the lungs, but it attacks the nerves, it attacks the person's ability to smell, sometimes even to function without needing breathing machines. So it's really an incredible advance in the science. And finally, I'll say that the vaccine also tips the balance, if you will, so that if an individual does get COVID-19, they get a very, very mild case of COVID-19 and they don't get hospitalized and they don't get sick enough to have to go to urgent care or go to the hospital. So I think in all those ways, as we look at our health down the road, these are really important investments that we can make in our future wellness.
Thank you. And Dr. Medley, your perspective on a holistic view and where do vaccines come in?
Since my colleagues spoke so wonderfully and completely on the physical aspects and for a great deal, I'd like to concentrate on the mental and spiritual aspects. And so we heard from my dear friend Jacqueline Prillman not so long ago on this program, where she shared, the totality of her experience. It was, I really appreciate her transparency. It's a blessing for us to be able to hear this experience from someone who's gone through it and has recovered or is recovering from it successfully. The mental effects of it, I heard so many of my colleagues, many nurses, physicians, residents, students in our hospital at Howard University say, oh, I finally got it. I got it. They're posting, number one, got the first shot. It seemed like a mental, emotional release and relief. And we could hear and see on the news every day, people were almost panicked. Why can't I get signed up? When am I going to get signed? Where can it happen? We were getting calls frequently. How can we get in to Howard University Hospital to get the vaccine? And at our Adventist healthcare system hospitals as well. And we had to advertise and be very clear. So there was this rush and there was this absolute need for my mental sanity and security and peace of mind. I want this vaccine. And then there were some who absolutely didn't want it, for any reason, and a lot of this, and when we talk about cultural needs, cultural sensitivities, at our hospital where it's predominantly Black African American, there are subcultures within the culture, that are African, and they are African, not just African descent, but they have family members, loved ones who are scared to death that their loved ones here are going to take this vaccine and just, not survive it. So it's actually being patient, listening, empathizing with them, answering their questions, making sure they have resources, getting our infectious diseases experts there to speak with each and every person one-to-one or in a group session via Zoom to be COVID safe. So, it's both sides of it, but each experience had its own antidote to give them some kind of peace or centering, regardless of the decision that they made. And then, of course, spiritually, which is so very important, our hope is in our Father who will always take care of us, no matter what we do. It's truly up to Him, and our trust in Him, that our lives are in His hands. And so that is of significant importance to healing and to prevention. And you're looking at someone who was going to work every single day on the front lines, and by God's grace and mercy and taking preventive measures, and certainly being vaccinated and having the colleagues that I work with that way as well. And promoting respect and understanding for those who felt differently, we are here and we are well. So there are so many aspects to consider, and we are so very grateful for life and health and strength, especially for those who would otherwise have not the opportunity for healthcare at all, the unserved and the underserved.
So Dr. Williams, for those who may be watching this or have taken time to understand more about the vaccination and they have a deeper understanding of its usefulness, what advice do you have for people when they go to speak to other people, to their friends, to their relatives? Dr. Medley just mentioned, how some subcultures, there's even, different variants of opinions even within subcultures. And, every group of people is not a monolith. But, once someone individually understands the usefulness of the vaccine, and especially within underserved communities, how can they then go about sharing that information?
So I think the first thing that I would emphasize is we need to listen to others. People speak out of their own experiences, and many persons in underserved communities have had bad experiences within the healthcare system, and that sometimes may color the way they view something that's new and something that's different. So first, let's listen. And two, let's be respectful. I think it's been emphasized so many times in this program that it is appropriate to ask questions. Respect the right of everyone to ask questions. So asking questions is not a bad thing. Let's get the facts. The Bible tells us, study to show ourselves approved unto God. And so we need to study and we need to find out. But one of the things that is most troubling to me about the questions I get from others out there is the amount of misinformation that exists about the vaccine. There are so many videos out there on social media that are absolutely correct. The fact that it's been published somewhere, or you heard it, or you saw a video, doesn't mean that it's correct, doesn't mean that it's accurate. And there is a profound statement I read in the book Counsels on Health, where Ellen White says that when we talk about health to others who don't share and don't have the knowledge of our faith, she says that if people see we are intelligent with regards to what we say about health, then they will be more ready to believe in our Bible doctrines. And if people see us, the counter to that is, if people see us saying things that are absolutely wrong, absolutely incorrect, we are losing credibility as we represent our Lord and as we try to share the good news. So part of being faithful and in our witness to others is ensuring that what we share is accurate. So what I would encourage others is to reliable sources of information. The Centers for Disease Control's website, the World Health Organization's website. Not to advertise my school, but my school has a website with a coronavirus resource, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Johns Hopkins has a coronavirus resource center. So there are many trusted sources. Those are just some. I know that Advent Health, for example, one of our healthcare systems, also has a COVID-19 resource center. So use reliable information. Yes, ask questions and try to be informed, but try to share only that which is reliable and accurate, and not because someone sent you a video, it means that it's accurate.
Well, that's a perfect note to end this conversation on. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, Dr. Catanzaro, and Dr. Medley. We will see Dr. Medley and Dr. Williams in our Q&A session at the end of this program. So now let's transition to our fourth panel discussion.
I really appreciate the information our experts just shared with us, and I hope that you, our viewers, found it helpful as well. COVID-19 has certainly changed our lives and made us pause and reflect on what it means to live a safe and healthy lifestyle. Thank you, Milan, for facilitating that discussion.
Now, our fourth panel of experts will look at how we communicate with each other when it comes to sensitive topics like health. And even more so, how do we respectfully communicate with those we may disagree with?
Many consider vaccine-related inquiries an invasion of their personal privacy. Both of our experts today are ordained ministers with distinguished careers, not only in ministry, but communications as well. Garrett Caldwell from Advent Health and Costin Jordash from Adventist Healthcare will now join Milan in discussing the pivotal role of respectful communication in this COVID-19 vaccine discussion. The first question I would like our panelists to address is, how should we communicate with someone we may disagree with when it comes to an emotional issue like vaccines?
Wow, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Because there isn't anyone, I think, who has not encountered someone they may or may not know, either personally or online, who has or who shares a different opinion from them regarding this vaccine. So what advice do you have, both you, Garrett and Costin, on how to politely disagree how to effectively communicate, rather, with people who share a different opinion from yours when it comes to the vaccination?
Well, first of all, I think we need to think about it as less of an argument that needs to be won and more of perhaps a smoke-filled room that needs to be cleared, or at least a maze that needs to be navigated. Let's not forget that most of us have not lived through a global pandemic before. We've lived through a year of essentially a traumatic event. And so there's going to be a lot of fear and suspicion. If you've ever survived an actual fire, like my smoke-filled room metaphor, you know that the smoke permeates absolutely everything that you have. And you're surprised how long the smell and the sense resonates in time. And I think people are going to be dealing with that. So let's not roll up our sleeves and put up our dukes, so to speak, and try to win a fight. But let's, in the spirit of humility and patience and love, listen to people. At Advent Health, we, beginning in October, started asking our consumers about their willingness to receive the vaccine once it became available. And so we've been tracking ever since November, asking over 300,000 consumers so far, how the sentiment has been towards the vaccine. And while we have seen a steady increase over time, there are still specific populations, specific demographics who have a lot of hesitancy. And we've also been trying to understand how to best address that. And the consumers reveal to us that there are certain things that matter to them. Number one, we think it's very important to address the trust concerns that do exist. People have lost trust for a variety of reasons, many of them happening in society, many of them happening in the field of healthcare itself. And so address those concerns with a very listening ear, as was mentioned earlier today, as much as possible in clearing the smoke-filled room, put them in contact with an expert like we've heard from throughout this program, who can answer very specific questions about how the vaccine was created and what the effects are. Number two, address the side effects. People, in many cases, are hesitating in moving forward because of their fear and concerns over the side effects, particularly if you have pre-existing conditions or you come from a vulnerable population. So those are important things to listen for and to engage in dialogue with persons about. And then let's make most of the conversation, I would suggest, about facts and about science, and reveal trial results, put them in touch with the websites that were mentioned earlier, that reveal data about how people have fared after receiving the vaccine. So those are just some ideas, but most importantly, listen, reserve judgment, and share your story and your experience with the vaccine. I think that's just a start.
Yes, thank you. And how about you, Costin? What advice would you give somebody on how to effectively communicate with people whom they disagree with?
Thank you, Milan. I'll expand on something that Garrett just mentioned, which is an incredibly critical point, and that is that a vital part of good communication is good listening. Communication is indeed it's a two-way street. It's really a dialogue, and this symposium actually is offering a biblical approach to this moment that we find ourselves in. And in order to get a really good understanding of what the Bible informs us when it comes to this, we have to look no further than to the ministry of Jesus. I don't think anyone will disagree that Jesus was an amazing communicator. And as part of that, he was an excellent listener. All we have to do is read through the Gospels and see how many questions Jesus asks when he is interacting with any person. So one of my favorite moments is two frustrated and confused disciples walking to the small town of Emmaus after the crucifixion. And Jesus shows up, he's incognito, and he recognizes that these two are frustrated. He recognizes that they are confused, and he begins to ask them a series of questions that leads to a very healthy conversation. And out of that healthy conversation comes just a greater understanding of a moment that for them was very disturbing, very confusing. So again, these are the types of tools that we can put to use in this moment, primarily excellent communication that depends on genuine and good listening.
Excellent, and our time is flying, as I knew it would, but in our final minutes, I would like to get both of your opinions on could one way that we could effectively communicate is to take on a different lens when looking at this issue. And one of those lenses could be seeing the vaccination or taking the vaccination as a form of stewardship. We've heard earlier how we've heard, many people have emphasized community and togetherness. Could stewardship also enter that conversation? And if so, what role does that play?
Well, I definitely agree with that perspective. We, as Seventh-day Adventists, have at the very foundation of our belief system the idea that the body is a temple. And a part of that implies that as a temple, it is cared for the habitation of another, and the most important other being, of course, the Spirit of God. But stewardship extends beyond our own body. Stewardship extends to the relationships that we have with other people and the care we exercise toward others. And one of the important reasons why you should very prayerfully and thoughtfully consider a vaccine is not just your care for your own body, but your care for the vulnerable people that you encounter every day. We aren't in charge of the people that we encounter if we are people of faith. We know that God helps navigate us to people that God wants us to have an influence over. And so if we keep that in mind, thinking about their safety, thinking about their well-being is going to be very important.
Yes, thank you. And actually, Costin, I want to tweak my question to you, since Garrett so wonderfully and fully answered the stewardship question. How can we be mindful of the power of our words, on top of sharing misinformation and how that harms the community? The way we speak, the tone and the intensity that we use and how we deliver our opinions and or misinformation about the vaccine, that takes a toll on people. So how can we remember kind of to zoom out and realize the power of our words, the impact, the negative impacts that can sometimes accompany our words? And we have about a minute left to cover that heavy topic.
Absolutely. So the reality is that our words matter, and more specifically, the way that we deliver our words, the way that we speak to each other matters. Again, the Bible gives us very, very good insight into this. Proverbs 15, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Gentle words bring life and health, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit, both there in Proverbs 15. So this is another responsibility that we have as Christians, to communicate wisely and gently about any topic, especially ones that are sensitive. But unfortunately, in this moment, we're not doing so well. in society in general, and even within faith communities. And all one has to do is look at social media, look at any comment thread, and you'll see that we're in general not doing so well. And when we don't communicate gently and respectfully and responsibly with each other, the result is that it polarizes our communities, it pulls us apart, and it certainly does not bring us together. I was looking at a recent article that one of my colleagues shared with me recently. There are pastors who, after decades in pastoral ministry, are quitting because their communities of faith, their local church congregations, are absolutely torn apart about the pandemic, about the vaccination effort. So it is very important for us to remember that as Christians, we do have a responsibility in how we communicate and what effect that has on society in general, and more specifically on our communities of faith.
Thank you so much, Costin, and we'll see Costin again later in our Q&A segment. But Garrett and Costin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. And now we are going to transition to our fifth panel.
Our final panel discussion today will take a look at the role that whole person health plays in the mission of the Christian church generally, and the Seventh-day Adventist church specifically. Are there specific ways the church and its members can assist local communities in its public health initiatives? Also, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected our nation's ongoing mental health crisis?
Our experts are Ingrid Slickers, a social worker and educator from Michigan, and Armando Miranda, a youth leader, pastor, and administrator for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The first question I would like them to address is, how should we as Christians apply the golden rule when it comes to health and caring for others?
The golden rule is definitely essential when it comes to community, and that's been a common thread throughout this program here. And Ingrid, what we realized, or what was evident throughout the pandemic, is the need for community. But there were some troubling trends and statistics that were recently published revealing the need for community, and also the what happens when there's isolation, how that affects certain populations. So can you care to discuss those troubling trends?
Yes, we know that COVID has been traumatic. I've heard various of you mention that as we've been talking. For various reasons, COVID has been traumatic. But sadly, some of the things that we're seeing, there has been a huge increase over the last 10 years in suicidality rates in our youth. But over the last year, that's gone up even more. But on the other hand, there's some newer studies that have shown that suicide rates have decreased in adults, especially early on in the pandemic. And so social scientists were looking at what that might be about. And the interesting piece, again, this is all still being discussed, was that there was this belief of suddenly people were helping each other right at the onset. People were looking out for their elderly neighbors and offering to get groceries or helping financially. There was this, we're all in this together. So this is early on, a coming together, which actually showed a decrease in mental health concerns for some. What can we learn from that? We can learn that amongst all these divisions, we've still got to find unity. So suddenly neighbors that maybe didn't vote the same politically were coming together to support each other. There have been so many things that have separated us over the last year. And sadly now vaccines are causing divisions again.
And we'll get more to that, the effect of the divisiveness, the divisive nature of this national conversation. Armando, I'm especially glad to have you because we're talking, and Ingrid mentioned it, but we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about youth. they were hit so hard this past year. Graduations were canceled or rescheduled, birthday parties, transitions to college, to high school. All of it was ripped out from under them, and they were thrown onto Zoom. But even in the midst of that, and so many have faced challenges, that suicide rate is just so devastating. How have youth that you've heard stories about youth, how have they shown resiliency and then even pivoted to even find ways to serve others?
Yes, hello. I have two stories. One, personally, my son is in 8th grade. He's finishing 8th grade. And for the last year and a half, he has been, in a bad place in regards of interaction with friends, all the things that he couldn't do, all the things that he couldn't share with his friends, online school. Right now, they went back to school and it's a little better, with the interactions and all these things. They have grown so much through this, but it is a tough way to grow. The other story that I want to point out is a group of young adults in Kansas City. The church over there in Kansas City, one church of Grand Haven, they started doing community service. Once they couldn't do much, the young adults went and helped the local food bank that they had in the church, and they became a center that was not closed. The church was not closed at all throughout the pandemic because they were serving the community. And you could see the amount of young adults that turned out to serve and found a calling in service that built togetherness, that built community contact, that built a team effort. And every single week they came together under the leadership of Pastor Mark Finley and everybody there, that church. And they are serving thousands of people every week. The young adults feel a purpose, feel a sense of helping the community, and they in turn have turned around into a resilient bunch. And I think that by helping others, it helps us all to receive a blessing too.
And Ingrid, we have discussed, and you already mentioned how this whole pandemic, and has even been alluded to in previous panels, how this was a traumatic experience. It's still a traumatic experience, but we may not realize that we may be contributing to another traumatic experience for people in our communities, between friends. How is this current divisive nature, which is everywhere, you can't escape it, how is it affecting our mental health?
We know that science has shown us, right? Secular social scientists, but we've known this from scripture, that we are better together and that we get through hard things together. Resilience is a big word that we use a lot now. Resiliency factors, that's one of our favorite words, right? Resiliency. Well, we know that the number one thing for resiliency is relationship. God models that for us, our vertical relationship with him, but he expects that with each other. So we go back to how we started this segment about the golden rule and treating others. Where are we in having relationships, and where are we in being in community? Just yesterday, when a couple of us were talking, I said, I pinned something on my board, on my bulletin board here on my desk to help me remember. And the little saying that I have says, as believers, we are all just walking each other home. And so I pause and I think about, where are we with that? Are we helping each other walk home? When's the last time I picked up my phone to reach out to someone, simply to text them and say, hey, how are you? And think about, how can I help them on their walk, on their journey? Because it's within community. We've had lots of suggestions today as to how to have these respectful conversations, but to be able to look beyond that, because the effect on our mental health is so great. We know that healing from trauma cannot happen unless you're in relationship and you're in community. Healing from loss cannot happen unless you're in relationship and in community. And what a privilege and an honor we have as Seventh-day Adventists, as Christians, to be in community. And then how many more can we bring into our community? And so when we talk about trauma, sometimes with my grad students, we talk about the promise in Romans that says, I want to be so filled with hope that only comes from above that I can overflow into others. And that's got to come from above so that I can overflow and then bring them into community.
That overflow. Wow, that's a powerful image. So now I want to transition to how can we heal? You know, what are some practical ways? I mean, you know, obviously this isn't something like, you know, for traumatic experiences, you don't heal overnight. For this, you know, we can't snap our fingers and have everybody get along. What are some practical tips? And Armando, I'll start with you. You can gear your comments toward youth. And then Ingrid, I'll go back to you. What are some practical ways that we can heal together and look out for each other?
As Ingrid mentioned, you know, one of the big aspects of youth ministry is community. There is no substitution for a community that cares for their young people. And it starts, you know, from home. Ingrid mentioned a study that came earlier last month, where it showed that the decrease in suicide rates for adults was lower, but for young people was higher. And that in turn, you know, also came with a discussion of the adults were feeling a sense of, hey, let's come together. But the kids didn't know, the young people did not know how to react to that. And so the young people will need the support of groups, of community, not only churches, but a community of friends and family who come around them and help them navigate this tough moments that they're coming out of or they're experiencing still. I can tell you, having drive-by birthday parties and just kind of say hi from afar without any interaction besides a hey, how are you doing? And then drive off, it has done a lot of harm in a way to our kids. But it's part of the pandemic experience that they are going through. And we're trying to do our best. One of the best things that I say is bring them together in safety, gather in safety, you know, provide them a place so that they can engage in safety. And that's one of the things that I encourage church members and family and community leaders to do for their young people.
Thank you. And Ingrid, how can we heal? Give us some tips.
So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about trauma is we encourage that we, instead of looking at each other as, what's wrong with you? We look at each other and say, what's happened to you? So what's your story? And so being able to listen to each other, I heard that a little bit today, being really able to listen to each other in relationship. And what does that look like practically? It takes intentionality, right? In our busy schedules, we were already, prior to the pandemic, having a difficult time finding time to be in relationship. Even at church, sometimes it was quick, hi, how are you? Fine, see ya. On we'd go. What can we do intentionally to be in relationship? We have enough technology to be able to do that across the world. Are we doing that intentionally? Are we connecting with people? I encourage nature. We know nature is healing. Again, we know that from scripture. We know it from the spirit of prophecy. Head out in nature. And, you know, we're headed into summer. Be in nature and be in nature together. Even if, you know, you need some distance, depending on where you're at, be in nature. We've also seen a lot of studies in the secular world about gratitude, interestingly enough, about how healing gratitude is. There's some recommendations that we need to be thankful for at least 3 things a day. I find that interesting because when we go back to scripture, Daniel opened his window 3 times a day and with gratitude prayed. So can we pause at the end of each day with our families? Even if we're by ourselves, we're encouraged to write it down. What are 3 things I'm thankful for today? It's good for your brain. Interestingly enough, So let's do that. These are practical things that we can do daily. The power of singing loudly, interestingly enough. So sing loudly. It's good for you. It's good for your body. It's good for your brain. I'm not a great singer, but I still try to sing loudly in the car along with the radio. So sing loudly. These are some practical things, but be in community and be in relationship.
Wow, those were lovely, lovely tips. I mean, just hearing you speak about it, Ingrid, put me in like a lighter, happier mood. So those are great tips, not only just for healing from this traumatic event, but just in general for your mental health, gratitude, nature. And I love the perspective of not asking what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. That's just like great for empathy and compassion. Well, I want to thank you both for your time and your expertise in this. You've made a lovely contribution, a great contribution to this conversation, a way to point us forward as we move forward to heal together and heal our communities. Thank you so much. All right, now we will transition to our question and answer segment.
We hope that you found our presentations today helpful and informative. We would now like to move us to the final panel segment of our program, and that is addressing some of the questions that you, our viewers, have shared with us. Recently, we provided an email address where you could send us questions in relation to the COVID vaccine, and our team has selected a broad group of topics for our experts to address. I'll send it back to Milan, who will reintroduce our guests and the questions they will answer. Milan?
Thanks, Roy. All right, so from clockwise around our screen here, we have Dr. Peter Landless, we have Dr. David Williams, Dr. India Medley, Kausin Jordash, and Dr. Vincent Hsu. Thank you all for coming back around and participating in this question and answer segment. Dr. Hsu, one question that we received repeatedly, like several times, maybe asked different ways. Should I just wait and see? That's, the phrase, wait and see. Instead of getting the vaccine now, instead of making my appointment now, should I just observe, see how side effects go, see how the trends go? What's the benefit in taking it now versus wait and see?
Certainly, we understand the hesitancy about taking something that's new. And under normal circumstances, it may be reasonable to wait and see. And I think for some people that still probably is going to be what they would like to do to feel more comfortable. But remember that these are not normal times. We are in a pandemic. Everyone wants to get back to normal quickly. And so far, what we have seen with our vaccines and the deployment, and so far with the reports of adverse events, we've given hundreds of millions of doses. And the vast majority of these doses have been given very safely. We also know that it's very efficacious. It works. We're talking about 95% effectiveness against getting this disease. So, we understand that some people may want to wait, but so far the evidence that we have right now is that it is safe, it is effective. We've had experience with mRNA vaccines, as Dr. Steve Smith has said in the previous segment. I don't think right now, given the fact that we are in a pandemic, that there is really additional questions that need to be answered right now. I think it's safe to go ahead and receive it now. Again, that is a decision that's going to be up to you.
And speaking of efficacy, I just want to follow up with a really quick question, another one that's related. Are there any concerns about decreased efficacy when taking the vaccine? So I guess that's in relation to, will a booster be needed relatively soon?
I mean, there are some things we have to follow. We have to follow time. So for those of you who say, we need to have 1 year of history with this vaccine, well, we're not there yet, but we are getting close to that. The phase 3 trials for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine started in late summer, so we'll have close to a year's worth of data. We suspect that based on what we know about natural infection, that there will be waning immunity, and so it is quite plausible. And I do think that we will probably need some booster vaccines because of that. The other thing, of course, that we have to follow are the variants. And there are variants throughout the world. You can see, of course, the massive problems that India has had to deal with. The nature of coronaviruses are that they will mutate. And so as a result, we have to track that. And so if there are mutations that occur in the genome of the virus and the spike proteins or nucleocapsid proteins that render these vaccines not to work as well, then they will need to also change those the vaccine composition as well. So, those are the factors we have to consider. So unfortunately, I would probably predict, although I would rather not have a booster, we'll probably need to have a booster at some point.
Dr. Landless, another question that we've seen a trend maybe perhaps with what we've received via the emails. What can someone do if their pastor is telling their members not to take the vaccine? How should a person approach their pastor, or what can this person do?
Thanks, Milan. That is an important question. And I would approach this with a disclaimer from myself right up front, is that all my professional career, I've had the blessing of working as a pastor and a physician. So now I'm going to have to look at it, how we would approach it, having someone coming to the pastor. I would recommend that we speak directly. I'd also recommend that we speak very kindly, also very respectfully, because we respect one another's views. I would also recommend that one speaks to one's pastor from the heart, share one's own total conviction of the importance of this amazing health message which we have, which gives us, and again, an optimal, at most of the time, immune system. And then I would also do it firmly and request, well, Pastor, what is our church saying on this level? And then once we've gone through those things, I would recommend that we very carefully look at the last paragraph of the recommendation of the church. The recommendation of the church is we recommend the use of these vaccines carefully, responsibly, having given it the appropriate thought, having done our research, and importantly, consulting with our healthcare providers. So that's what I would do, and I would encourage and I've been so thrilled with the approach that I've witnessed on this panel today, on the panels throughout the day, one of embracing, respect, caring, hearing each other. And that's what I would recommend we continue to do, because we haven't got time to generate more heat than energy. So let's get the information, kindly share, and be very, very firmly frank at times in a kind, respectful way. That's sometimes very much needed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Landless. And Costin, in a similar vein, what about someone who's wondering, or not wondering, has a couple of friends, fellow members of their church who did read what the church put out about vaccinations, did read what Dr. Landless just mentioned, and has, as a result, said, I want to leave the Adventist church because of this. I don't like the church's stance, therefore I want to leave. What would you advise for that person when they come across a fellow member who shares that belief?
Yeah, excellent question, Milan. I would say first, what we have to really grapple with, or should I say maybe realize, is that the work of the church, the work of the Christian church in general, in our context, the work of the Seventh-day Adventist church, is not defined by this moment, right? In other words, it is not defined by the COVID-19, or should I say the pandemic and the COVID-19 vaccine. The work of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the work of the Christian church is much broader than that. And you can begin to see the difference that the church has made within our communities, the difference that the gospel message of Jesus Christ through the work of the church and through the work of those who make up the church, members and pastors, administrators, that it has made a significant difference in the life of one person, one community, one country, and one world. So one reality that we have to grapple with is, should we sever ties with that community over this moment, regardless of where we are on this debate? And one thing that I would encourage is for us to remember that broader context, that many, many years of work and service that have made a significant difference in our world and will continue to do so until the coming of Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Costin. And Dr. Medley, someone wants to know the best way for them to encourage their friends or family to take the vaccine. They have taken it themselves, but they want to have a conversation with their friends and families. What are some suggestions you have for them to help facilitate that conversation?
Well, you know, those kinds of conversations are happening all the time. Some of them are successful and some of them not quite so. But I would recommend first and foremost that we are, during this conversation, we have a good understanding of the individual's concerns. What are your concerns so that they can be addressed directly and sincerely and accurately? I would address those concerns first and foremost, whatever has been identified, and not in a defensive way. Are you concerned that you might get very ill, that there are side effects? And, you know, have you ever taken a drug or medicine that was very important for you to have and felt the benefit of it, and yet you still might have been sore from it? You may have also had a fever for 24 hours and then it went away. You know, those kinds of things, just really bringing up actual stories from their own lives and accept it, being accepting, non-judgmental, but just not afraid to speak the truth, but speaking the truth in love and encouragement as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Williams, one question, a pointed question that we received: should we trust the vaccines when politics and political arguments have influenced their production?
That's a really good question, especially in the time that we are living that is so politically polarized. I think what is very important that everyone understands, yes, it is true that one of the reasons why the vaccines were produced so quickly was the United States government of money to the pharmaceutical companies so they could do it. So they didn't have to go out and raise the research and development money. So the money and the support of the government did play an important role. And that's why, as part of that commitment, the vaccines are free to everyone in the United States. But I think it's really important for individuals to realize that the vaccines were made, the work was done by scientists who take their jobs very seriously, and the attention to safety in the whole process, the attention to producing highest quality using the most innovative strategies and techniques that are out there within the scientific field today is admirable. So that I think we should realize that while there's political debate about the vaccines, when it came to vaccines, politics didn't make a role. This was work done by very careful scientists who do every single day.
Dr. Hsu, we have a very specific question about people who have been vaccinated. If, let's say, you want to get a group of friends together, you and all your friends are vaccinated, right? But all of you have or received different vaccines. So maybe 2 of you got the Pfizer, 3 got Moderna, and 2 got the Johnson & Johnson. Is that safe gathering in a sense of, do the efficacy levels of the vaccines, are they compatible in that type of setting?
It is safe enough. It is really safe. I mean, the most important vaccine is the one that you actually get. And yes, there are small differences between vaccines about efficacy. But with all the trials that have been done with these 3 vaccines, the most important endpoint was really the effectiveness against severe disease. And for everyone who got these vaccines, severe disease was really highly protective against that. So you can feel secure in that when you meet with your group of friends and they're vaccinated, it really doesn't matter which ones you get. You can meet together. You don't need to wear your mask. You don't need to social distance. That's really what we're trying to get at. But it does involve everyone getting vaccinated.
Thank you. Dr. Landless, I'll ask you to put on your pastoral hat one more time for this next question. Someone wanted to know, am I demonstrating a lack of faith by taking the vaccination?
Thank you for that question, Milan. It's a very important question. And it's been touched on throughout the symposium today. And that is, what is the importance of our health message, our lifestyle, our beliefs in helping to prevent disease? And I have no question that by living this amazing health message, which God has entrusted to this church as a gift of grace, that we do have increased quality of life, even in our broken state, that sometimes, often, we may even have increased length of life, but we are not going to have eternal life on this earth until Jesus comes. And so what are we really trying to do? We're trying to understand, is it a denial of my faith? Is it a denial of what I've learned if I do go ahead and have, for example, a vaccine? I think with tremendous encouragement in my own heart of the experiences where God has spoken to people, telling them to use an instrument in the process of healing. I think of Naaman going to the river and bathing in it. God didn't have to ask him to do that, but there was an intermediate. We think of Jesus with the man who was blind, and he mixed the saliva and the dirt and used that. So I don't believe it's a question of lack of faith. And interestingly, and I'm so delighted to be with this exceptional group that we've had today, and my very good friend, Dr. David Williams as well, and pointing out that he often quotes that the Bible and science, rightly viewed, are not opposed to each other. They complement each other, and doing this the right way should give us an increased encouragement that we are not denying faith. In fact, we are utilizing an instrument he has placed in our hands. Never forget, the reason this church was given a health message was not so that we could be long-lived sinners, but because our work is not yet finished. When asked that question, Ellen White was very clear. We were given this message because our work is not yet done. So whatever means God entrusts to us, gives to us, I don't believe that if it's helpful, if it's sensible, if it stands the tests of evidence-based, peer-reviewed health science and is carefully and responsibly done, I do not believe that this is a denial of our faith in what we know.
Dr. Williams, another question is about the vaccines and children. What data is there that supports the safety of the vaccines for children? Because we know the age has been lowered, between 12 and 15 for children can receive the COVID vaccinations. But what data is there to support that recent decision?
So I think that one of the things we need to realize that with the vaccine, there is intensive studies still going on. There is intensive safety monitoring that is continuing with the vaccines. And so, yes, we have had, we now know from the research that has been done that it's safe for children 12 years or older to get the vaccine. But there is work going on right now looking at even younger children. The jury is still out on that. We will get reports, I would think, in the next several months. So that I think what's important for people to realize is the amount of care and the fact, as has been said on this panel before, that so many hundreds of millions of people around the world have gotten the vaccine. The evidence of the benefit is overwhelming, even as we seriously take into account the questions that individuals might have and the risks that might be there. So the data, the science is good. Children 12 years or older can have the vaccine, and it's based on the same kind of research that was done that told us that it was safe to give it to the adults.
Wonderful. Dr. Medley, this was already addressed earlier in the program, but since it's been asked several times, people want to know, I get the vaccine, I feel fever, I feel chills, doesn't that mean something bad is going on inside me? If I get the vaccine, I get these side effects, is that alarming?
It may be alarming to some people, but it is what I've said is it means the vaccine is working, that it is developing these much needed antibody reaction so that our body will be able to respond appropriately and as the vaccine intended to protect us from this virus. So it is indeed a good sign. And I find that many people are relieved to hear that certain measures can be done to help with those minor side effects when and if they are experienced. And then, it's amazing how many people have, in their stories, in their own journey of experiences, have not had any side effects as well. But I find that when we are able to use those teaching moments to reinforce that this is what is supposed to happen, the medicine is working, your armies are getting stronger inside of your bloodstream, in your system, and it's revved up and ready to go to be a defense for you if you should ever come in contact with the COVID virus. Or if you do get these symptoms, it also can mean that it's just very minimum. It's taken down the severity and the ability to cause the disease to get out of control, if you will.
Thank you. We're receiving a lot of questions about the relationship between observing the health message or being practitioners of the Adventist health message. And if someone is a devout follower of the Advent health message, they're struggling with the need to get the vaccine. Like if I'm following all of these, if I'm very mindful of what I'm putting in my body, how I treat my body, will that be enough? Dr. Shu, what would you have to say to someone who says, I'm observing, I follow the health message. Why do I need the vaccine? What would you say to that?
I think all of us want to do what we can to take care of ourselves. I mean, our body is a temple of God. We want to keep our immune systems as intact as possible. But vaccines are there because they provide that additional protection that sometimes, the body's immune system isn't able to handle. I mean, we have medicines for a variety of different things to treat ailments. We have antibiotics, a lot of other, things that are used to treat us. So from that standpoint, vaccines are just another tool that is used to help augment, to help keep our bodies healthy. I think this is what I think this is what we should be doing to take care of ourselves. And from my perspective, I think this is what we're trying to do to keep our body as a temple of God, to be as healthy as possible.
Thank you. And Costin, we want to make sure that we are equipping and empowering our viewers to make informed decisions about whether to take the vaccine. And where are some trusted sources? What would you recommend for people to visit online, or who should people speak with when making this decision for themselves and for their family? What are some trusted sources?
Sure, absolutely. We begin here in the United States clearly with the CDC, the FDA, your local state government. They will all have online portals that are related to COVID-19 with copious amounts of resources that you could look into. Within our local church, or should I say our community of faith context, the North American Division has put together a page that is specifically dedicated to this. And I'm sure that across our division, you have a variety of entities, whether they be union conferences or conferences, that offer the same thing. Also, our healthcare systems, the 5 healthcare systems that are located here in the North American Division, all have areas on their website that are dedicated to COVID-19 and have, again, a plethora of information available, trusted information that you could very much look into. And I would dovetail to that, Milan, the idea that we definitely encourage individuals to examine the information for themselves. No one would argue that part of intelligent dialogue isn't examination and exploration. Even the Bible encourages us. God says in Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together," correct? However, there's this area of specialty, or this idea of specialty, that we also have to keep in mind. There are some within our society that have worked very hard, that have studied very hard to become experts in a certain area. I think of my mechanic, who has worked on dozens of different models and thousands of cars. And because of that, I choose to trust his expert advice. We're about to bring in an arborist, a tree expert, into our backyard because some of our trees look like they're having trouble. An expert that I choose to trust her or his advice when it comes to what to do with our trees. This very much is the same when it comes to infectious disease. We certainly can look into the information and study it, but we also have to choose at some point to trust expertise and specialty for those who have worked very, very hard to achieve it.
Thank you so much, Costin, for those practical tips. Dr. Landless, we have about a minute left. Would love if you can wrap this up, or give us a firm takeaway, perhaps hope as we move forward, or key points that we should remember. What would you say as parting words to our audience?
Thank you, Milan. I would, without a doubt, confirm and affirm that we have hope. We have hope in a faithful God who has promised never to leave us nor forsake us. I also have confidence in his church. We may have disagreements, but we are his children. He loves us. He cares for us. I pray we'll learn to continue to love each other. And then, as we agree and disagree, let's always do that with respect. It may be as clear as anything to someone else, and they may think it's as clear as that to me. I need to put myself in the shoes of others and deal with that in a very kind, generous, caring, dare I use the word that was used a lot through the day, loving way, because that's how they will know we are his disciples, if we have love one for another. Think, study, pray, and be led of God's Spirit. He will see us through by his grace.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a powerful message to end on. Dr. Landless, Dr. Williams, Dr. Medley, Costin Jordan, and Vincent Hsu. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Cannot thank you enough for coming and sharing with our audience and just contributing to this program. Thank you so much. And now I have the pleasure of introducing, or not introducing, but get ready to see a message, a brief message from the president of the North American Division, G. Alexander Bryant. He has a brief message on this very important topic.
First of all, I would like to start off by just thanking all those who have participated in the program this afternoon. It's been some exciting information, a great discussion. And as Christians, we are all called to honor God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Part of that is caring enough about our neighbors getting sick, even if I am strong enough to withstand the illness that comes from COVID, because it affects all of us so differently. The decision about vaccination should be done carefully, with much thought, after all the facts have been reviewed. Nothing is ironclad, but you make the best decision with the information provided. This afternoon, you have heard some hard facts by some incredibly knowledgeable and gifted people. My personal testimony is I was vaccinated because the facts I read and weighed told me that I'm better off with the vaccine than I am without it. I have several other vaccinations. When I'm about to travel, I make sure I have all my immunization shots, whether that is yellow fever or tetanus or typhoid. I do that because I believe that I'm better off with that protection than without it. And it may be true that the body has some defenses. However, the God who designed the body also gave mankind some knowledge on how best to preserve that body, the temple that God has entrusted us with. As Seventh-day Adventists, we have a health message that reminds us that the bodies we have are the temples of the Holy Spirit, by which God dwells in us. We therefore have even a greater responsibility to do all we can to preserve it and to protect it from all illnesses, including COVID. I would encourage each of us, after hearing the discussion this afternoon, to reflect on what you have heard. Pray about it and ask God to help you to put to use the information you have heard today, and make the best decision you can to preserve the temple of God, which is in us, and to be reminded that we are our brother's keeper. So we do it not only for us, but we do it for others. May God bless you as you wrestle with this decision and as God leads you in yours.
Elder Bryant, we want to thank you for sharing your pastor's heart as we consider everything we've learned here today. There is a lot to reflect on and pray about as we search for the best ways to beat COVID-19 and return to some level of normalcy. Thank you again for sharing of your time with us.
We want to thank you, our viewers, for joining us today as we discuss this important topic and its impact on our communities, churches, and schools. We pray you have found the information shared here helpful as you and your families consider receiving the COVID vaccine.
That's right, Carlton. We want to thank you for joining us today and ask you to pray for our communities, families, and friends as we work together to overcome the influence of this disease on all of our lives. Thank you again for spending this time with us, and God bless.